Okay, I hope this works. I can't hear you again. Oh, no.
Testing. Can you hear
Yeah,
me
I
now?
can. Okay, I can hear.
Okay.
It's working. All right. I did go through your reply, by the way, to that thread on
hmm
conceptual on concepts. And I mean, maybe we can. Do you want to start with that? I've got copy paste here of different things, and then we can
Sure.
do those questions in the OPA.
That
So
works.
yeah, okay. Let's have a look at what I copied and marked that I wanted to. Okay, so when you set up your hierarchy, I understood. Okay, so there are, I think this is what David was calling orthogonal concepts. Like there is some feature that you're capturing that then conflicts with another feature. And so when I chart it like I did, I can't necessarily get the order correct. I have all these issues. Like I have to repeat line, like you said. Um,
Yeah, it's mainly an issue of visualizing it and
yeah,
displaying it. I think you had the right idea.
yeah.
I wasn't sure quite what he meant by orthogonal. I guess let me find where he said it. So I know the
Well, I didn't
context.
either, but I didn't either, but I think he means equally important features. For example, let's see, the number of sides and whether sides are equal in length. So irregular and
Yeah,
regular polygon. I'll copy paste to you the
they're like different properties. They're not necessarily of the same variety. They're not opposites, but they're just unrelated things almost. Like number
uh,
of sides isn't really to do with length. They're
mm,
not really things that are the same. Like you're not in the hierarchy, you're not relating the same properties. Like you're not, it's not a hierarchy of like different lengths going like from like miles to feet to inches and so on, like down like that.
yeah,
I mean, those would be just narrower and narrower and not orthogonal. Orthogonal would be more like this, which is a little more complicated, but you do have the right idea. You're just trying to classify different things at different parts of the hierarchy.
yeah,
And he was kind of agreeing with me that there's no absolute more or less abstract. And I was just getting a way of portraying the abstractness. Um, you could argue different things are perceptual, but in general, like you wouldn't say like shape is what you perceive directly. You see squares, triangles, circles.
yes,
And I guess you could say you see lines. That's iffy, but dots, dots aren't really a thing that, well, it's arguable, but either way, it's not like one direction. It's always up is always abstract and down is always less abstract. It's just, you could write a hierarchy in just in terms of um, like size, almost like narrowness versus breadth. So
right,
like a
and
dot is very, very narrow, but it's not necessarily less abstract than a square because, or think of it like an atom, like it's more basic than the cells of your body, but they're more particular and almost in a sense abstract because you can't um, see them without aid.
mhm,
But on the other hand, they're not abstract because they are perceivable things with the right tools. So it's not that they're abstract in the way that gravity is. Like there's not like a gravity that you can perceive. There's no, so it can get complicated, but in a hierarchy like you're trying to go up more of a developmental angle to it and
mhm,
logical at the same time. So you're trying to organize the way to think about different geometric properties. So a good way to organize it would be just the conceptual hierarchy in terms of if you want to understand it in its entirety, like you would presuppose somewhere that there's dots and lines, whether or not you got it explicitly. Like you, as a 4-year-old, you would know what a square is.
Yeah.
And implicitly, there's something about lines and dots, maybe, but it's not really conceptual. It's just.
I understand.
It's just. It doesn't mean they understand it concretely. It's just. But they have the material to, the perceptual stuff to get there.
Yeah. Continue.
And this is a lot of something that librarians would do, or I mean, that's what information and library science is. A lot of dealing with hierarchies like this in different indexes and whatnot, in dictionaries or encyclopedias. It's all about how to organize these concepts.
Right. Okay. I understand. And I understand what you're saying in terms of you could have a hierarchy that looks at narrowness, like is capturing the relationship of one thing to another, but narrowness doesn't mean it's more perceptual. It could be like I think the distinction that David used was something like existential versus epistemological type knowledge. So I understand that. I didn't understand what you meant about, where was it that you said? I think you said it now as well. Maybe I have to go to the original post to find it. There's something. I'll go quickly. The absolute. Okay, I just remembered anyway, so it's fine. There's no absolute. You said something like there's no absolute level of abstractness, but then later on you said distance from perceptual level. Isn't that what abstractness is? Like if it's more abstract, it's more distant from the perceptual level.
Yes.
Okay.
What I mean, there's no like calculation. There's no equation or specific method I can give to determine this is more and this is less. It would be a really complex argument to say something is more or less abstract.
Okay. Wouldn't it just be the number of reductions?
I mean, you could approximate it that way.
Okay.
But it's not like an absolute answer. It really depends on so many variables. I can't really give you even a rule to come up with it other than this general idea of just like if you organize things in a hierarchy, you can get a sense of what's more distant than another. Like in relative terms rather than absolute.
Okay. I spent a while reading through the rest of his reply, and I mean, I understand he's basically talking about how to graphically represent a hierarchy by then talking about, for example, he said something like triangle and quadrilateral have the special linguistic coding that is essential to concepts, separate symbol as pentagon, hexagon, heptagon, octagon, and linguistic constructions, collocations of symbols. And so he's saying, okay, you could condense that and all that stuff. So I got most of, I think, and then he said, since abstractness isn't an absolute property, which is what you're saying, it's hard. There's no formula for working out a level of abstractness. But I didn't get really like, okay, so what? Like, is all of this basically to say that it's not about the amount of times you use a conceptual term that determines its importance? Because it wasn't like there was no obvious, even after doing everything in this thread, there was no obvious takeaway from me. Like I understand, having spoken to you, I understand like, obviously it's not the amount I use a concept, even if it's an implicit concept like existence. It's more this thing of doing the work, something that has a cognitive load that's important. But was that the whole point of the thread, to show me that it's not about anyway, I don't get all this stuff that I've done about arranging polygons.
I mean, it got kind of not really off topic, but if you want to get at what's importance, I guess we want to pull out more like direct things in your mind towards that direction. What does importance mean? We can think of importance as, well, there's many ways to think of importance, but one way to think of importance is identifying what's essential in something. That if we want to know what's important about concept formation, you could say what function it serves for your mind. You could say that importance has to do with the sort of information you want to gather about something. So whether if you're discussing geometry, there's certain things you might want to focus on or bring your attention to more than others. It could be, say, what describes the most features here, or it could be what you refer to a lot within this hierarchy, which, I mean, there's some amount of frequency that might matter. Because if you're using something a lot, that's another way of saying important. But we're trying to specify what important is beyond just merely the amount of times you see it. But we could say we see it a lot because one reason or another. It could be a feature that crops up a lot. So because it crops up a lot, we want to condense it and put it into a concept.
Yeah.
That's one way to think of importance. Importance could be like you want to accomplish some goal, like you're trying to figure out a science problem or a math problem. You might want to organize your concepts slightly differently depending on what you're trying to attain. Like if you're trying to figure out details of geometry, you can think of one way. But on the other hand, if you're just trying to describe basic developmental concepts like shapes and numbers, you might not have to go into the same detail, but rather a matter of specifying concepts a little bit more to think like an adult for like high school education. You can really alter things depending on what you're trying to think about. And we can have these hierarchies to assist with that. And that's kind of why I was saying it's not specifically Rand that would do this sort of thing, that in philosophy you probably would talk about this sort of thing, even if you're just talking about Aristotle.
You mean use a taxonomy to analyze some
or at
idea?
least what role the taxonomy plays in thinking about, say, philosophy of science, for example.
Oh, okay.
You might say that's relevant, you might say it's not. And Rand is coming from the more Aristotelian perspective, which would use taxonomies and whatnot. And taxonomies are very useful throughout different fields. But within objectivism, it's saying that's not just like a practical function, but it describes the way concepts are organized, the way to describe concepts objectively. It's more than just a useful tool. It's rather an essential tool of thinking.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, I've understood that
Okay.
part of, yeah, not completely, but I have understood that out the way and I've understood the way, yeah, the way the word it is. I've understood enough to understand that, yes, when we think conceptually, our concepts are organized in a hierarchy, even though it's not immediately self-evident. There's a certain process with which you reach concepts. It doesn't necessarily need to be in a specific order. Like I think the example was the falling apple. Like you don't need to observe a falling apple to figure out to discover the concept gravity. Let's say if you're a physicist, it could have been anything else. But I still, I mean, from what you said, you're saying that the whole point of I just got confused about what the whole point of this was. Like, because I didn't see how it tied into frequency, but I guess what you're saying is that the key here is that it's about what's important, and what's important, maybe frequency is one feature of what's important in terms of concepts, but it's not the only thing. And there are other things that matter more. For example, is this fundamental, like in shaping the field? I guess I'm just sort of, that's what I'm thinking. Is this fundamental in shaping the field? Like, for example, rationality and affecting every other concept in the field? And then depending on what it is you want to do, uh, what's important may also be a different concept. So that's what the main thing I got from what you're saying. Does that sound sensical?
Yes. Yes. You could have your conceptual hierarchy, and then I guess within that you can modify it as you need. But there's a general hierarchy that we're operating with. I shouldn't say general hierarchy. You have a hierarchy of concepts or an organization of concepts within your mind, and it connects all knowledge together.
Yeah.
And that's the sense in which Peikoff would say that the true is the whole, like I mentioned, that everything is connected, not just in a metaphorical sense, but the way we understand our concepts, they are interrelated. And that's important to keep in mind. And they're interrelated, then we might need to see features like, depending on the concept we're dealing with, what's important might be different. It'd be just a matter of that. Like, how you determine what's important is maybe one of the more difficult questions within epistemology. How do you know what matters? But broadly speaking, uh, using a hierarchy like this can help us determine what is important and figure out what's doing the conceptual work. And it would be very open-ended for sure. There's no, if you really want to get into, say, the organization of geometry there, you would need to be a geometer probably to really even bother with doing that.
I definitely don't want to get into organizing it.
Yes.
I didn't enjoy that at all, to be
Yes.
honest. I just thought I'd get some insight.
So as a non-expert, that might be as far as you need to go because it brought you to enough understanding of what you wanted, what you needed. So as far as what you were getting at with conceptual frequency, you wanted to identify what was important by frequency, and that it's not useless, but you might want to think about it a bit more abstractly than that. It's too maybe concrete. It's too concrete, maybe. Like you don't want just the frequency. You want frequency in order to identify what frequency of some might point out something, as I mentioned, that you use a lot, so you want to condense it. That's the way that frequency matters. Not merely because it's frequent, but it's frequent and you can conclude that therefore it's being used a lot, it needs to be condensed.
And also, another feature that would be important, which you mentioned and I didn't think of, was doing the work. And I interpreted that as a lot of things are dependent on it, but not only that, there's a lot of cognitive effort required to, it's not like, for example, existence is implicit. Like the amount of cognitive effort required for me to go, okay, here's an explicit identification of existence. This is completely different than, that may be frequent in the sense that it's implied in everything I say, but compare that to the cognitive effort required for me to explain and get my head around rationality, for example, which, by the way, I don't, but it's just, yeah. Does that explain it? So doing the work. I'm stealing from you. I'm listening. I'm just making some
doing the work, because in the practical sense that if we're developing concepts, it needs to be practical. Part of what Rand would like to say, and I'm sure Peikoff expounds on this, that the theoretical is practical. And actually, you mentioned in one of your questions, like, it's similar to the moral versus the practical, where the moral is practical. The moral versus the practical.
The moral versus the practical. Where did I say ask?
In your questions on ethics, it's similar to that. Like, what's moral is practical under objectivism, and within epistemology, what is true is also practical. That we're not just identifying features that are true about these things, but by being true, we'll also be identifying practical things. So understanding what is practical isn't an exercise in just doing things, but an exercise in the actual function of this. That it is practical to understand this, and it's valuable as philosophically speaking. Like it applies to.
Okay, I understood the latter part of like the practical the thing that is important in terms of its function is also important in like in practice it does help, but I didn't see, because with that I agree, like the moral is the practical. Maybe I'm not sure which question you're referring to, so
Well, we'll get back to it when we get to the O part chapter. I'll refer to it again.
Oh, okay.
I'm trying to say that, well, some people might think of philosophy as it doesn't really have anything to do with your life. It's just you're solving a puzzle. And if you want
Okay.
the objective answer, practicality has nothing to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
But under the Aristotelian or even Randian way of thinking, that if we're talking about epistemology, it does, understanding it is practical, that there is practical application to it, and even understanding it is its use in practical life.
Okay.
It's hard to relate that, but it's more like taking philosophy who needs it and saying disinterested objectivity detached from yourself is can't really even tell you the truth. That we need the practical and the theoretical together.
I understand. And I'm not sure if you're referring to a question I asked in one of the later OPAR things, but I wouldn't open them up because I'm like just still organizing, or it's all a
Sure.
mess. I'm just organizing stuff in there. But
Sure.
okay, so I got everything you're saying, but what was the relationship of this, the moral practical split, to this issue of important or I guess we'll go with the concepts that do the work.
Yeah, I'm just trying to illustrate that it's worth thinking about just in terms of applying it to your life, like what goals you have and understanding
Okay.
something. And you don't need to worry about just the detached philosophical sense of
I
it.
understand. Okay, it makes complete sense. Yes, I understand. So that would be going back to your earlier point of like what's important also depends on what you're trying to accomplish or do. Like, if you're a geometer, is that I didn't know that's how you say it, but that's cool. If you're a
Yeah.
geometer, then your what you consider important in terms of shapes and polygons might be different than someone else. Like you will go into more detail. There'll be more maybe concepts that someone else won't bother with, and you will. And so same applies here when I'm studying philosophy. Like obviously there are some things in terms of objectivism that are important if one wants to integrate it into their life, but it also depends on my own goals. Like maybe I have some other goal. And so you're saying, okay, then it's also, we have to factor that in terms of, because it's objective in relation to me. It's pretty, I think for me, it's pretty, my goal is, my primary interest in philosophy is, one I just loved some of Ayn Rand's books, the fiction, and I do want to study the philosophy just out of pure interest. But another very big motivation would be improving my thinking. And having read some epistemology, I'm like, I think this is like, in terms of restructuring the way, like automatic patterns of asking questions and thinking about specific subjects and like having a certain framework to approach something, like a beginning framework. I can see how integrating that will prevent things like asking repeat questions, trying to reduce something that's not reducible, that you have to take as a context or an assumption, little things like that. And I'm not 100%, but I can see how it might help. So I would say that's another big motivation. Yeah.
It made me think of how Rand liked to describe objectivism as philosophy for living life on Earth. Like everything in philosophy here we're talking about serves a function for your life.
Yes.
And that's really what we're getting at. Like, of course, your wider goal is on living life as best you can, but we could have variation of our goals as well. And that won't invalidate any objectivity. in fact, just a necessary aspect of objectivity to understand where we are in our lives, understand different information we're using, different sub goals we might have, like we were talking about before. Like you have your goal to live life, but you could have different sub goals to serve that, which might vary depending on you as an individual. Like
Yes.
depending on like health or skills or where you grew up or things like that. What could cause variation in what you ought to pursue. And that's where we'll also have variation in epistemology. Like we're not all going to know the same thing. We're not all going to need to know the same thing. And sometimes even knowing too much knowing things that are sort of no function to your life or actually could hinder your life too. That we need to think about things in a way that serve our life, and both in terms of us uniquely and us by nature being human.
Yeah. And so I understand and agree with what you're saying. It then becomes a problem of like, okay, what does that mean? Then what do I select as important in terms of, the concepts that do the work? That's like then applying that idea is difficult.
Yeah, it is. And I have my own answers to that, but I don't want to get into that right now since we're trying to
Yeah.
focus
Okay.
on Rand's answers. I
Okay.
mean, I have specific answers that I've come to understand, but
Hmm.
to get the framework first, I think you had the right idea. Like, yeah, that's the problem. That's hard, and
Yeah.
that's kind of how it is.
Yeah. Okay. It's something I can work on for sure, focusing on what's
Mhm.
important with the like thinking in terms of essentials. So you also said something I'm interested in, which is you were saying everything is interrelated. And I know Opar gets into this later, and I actually wrote down some things related to this in, I think, the chapter on reason, or maybe it was on objectivity, but everything is interrelated. And then do you remember just before you said that now, that all
Yeah.
concepts are interrelated in the hierarchy?
Mhm.
And then part of your reply to that thread that I wrote on conceptual frequency and language was context. You kept talking about context in language learning, context. You have to learn in context. And so with context, I understand there was a definition given something like it is the units or the elements that condition a unit of thought or something like that. Um, And if everything is interrelated, then isn't the context everything? Like, how do you know what I'm saying? Like, in a sense, everything is
Yes.
the So how does one then go, okay, everything is the context, but the actual context is what is the boundary of the
That's a good question. How do I know where the boundary
is that
is?
how to think of it though? Like there's everything is a context in a sense, but when you're thinking, there is also like some boundary is it a bound? I don't even know. Like, but that's confusing to me.
I'm trying to think of an example. So if your context, well, in some way, when you're talking about abstractions, whatever kind of concept you're abstracting away some information, in a way you have to know what you've abstracted away, just to realize that you have, but also realize that you've set a constraint. I guess that is a good way to think of it, that your concepts, even as you use them, are setting a boundary and constraint in what features you want to be thinking of or what things in reality you're referring to. So if you're, whatever your definition of, say, like a car is, you have your set of parameters in reality of what does a car refer to? What are the things in reality that cars are? And are we, say, referring to a specific set of cars within reality, like, say, all electric cars? We were setting a boundary there too, like cars that operate only on electricity but not gasoline, and see what you might think about it that way. Then you could narrow it more to, like, we're talking about cars in the US, electric cars in the US in Massachusetts or something. Like that's a way to set context and realize where you're trying to set your mind or place your mind. Like, you're not trying to be literally in all of existence at once. You're not like Dr. Manhattan in The Watchmen. Like, you're not in every location and every time at once. Like, you have to constrain where your consciousness, in the sense that, like, the environment in front of you. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I'm thinking also. I think that I'm just thinking now that maybe it is a case of you are objectively, like you said, setting the boundaries. You're selecting them in a sense to your own purpose for what's required for thinking about that specific thing. And then you're assuming that either the you have the implied concepts required for, like, obviously in a sense everything is well, I don't know if you could even say everything is a context, but everything conditions a unit of thought. Like if we're talking about a car, then there's the universe, there's existence, there's like all those things are implied. But in order for you to think about it, you assume maybe that all that stuff is like automated, and so you only work within that defined boundary of what's required to think about the issue. And so then it becomes an issue of like, all right, how do you select that boundary of thinking about the problem well? Which I think maybe that's what context is. So in a sense, it's not true that everything is context. It's the context refers to this process of you picking a few units to be conscious of that help condition the thought that you're having. Like if you want me to make it more, because I hate when I just talk like this because it's just so abstract and I feel like it means nothing. But I guess it's a question of like, well, do you want to? I'll give an example, but do you first want to comment on?
I think that's the right idea. I don't personally like the word condition. I know what you're referring to as
Okay,
just,
I just copied peak off, like, because I don't know how to. This is
oh,
hard, man. Yeah,
yeah,
he
that
uses that
sounds,
word.
I probably would define it a bit differently. I like just environmental constraint of thinking, or just a constraint to your thinking. Like if you drew a box around what you want to talk about, what would be in the box?
Yeah,
I mean, it's simple as that to me.
yeah,
And anything outside the context is just out of context. I mean, you could think of everything at once in a way that's what philosophy gets at sometimes. The context is everything. That's why the context is you can set. But then you could just narrow it, narrow it, narrow it. And concepts serve that function of narrowing our focus and setting context even. It could be a bit more complicated because you could set a context without concepts, but it could be like a give and take between the two, that sometimes the concept helps determine what context you want, or sometimes the context can help determine what you want to integrate together into a concept. Like you could just have an idea of, I want to understand the business competition of electric cars in the United States. And you could set that as a context, as a way to form concepts about car sales, electric car technology, and things like that. You could figure out concepts that way. Or if you're a biologist, or say a marine biologist, you could set your context to focusing on, say, bottlenose dolphins in the Southern Atlantic or something. And you can use that to develop your ideas and thoughts, because you set your context and you set constraints on what you want to think about and where you want to take in observations of the world.
yeah. So there's a few things I was thinking about. So one is your analogy of the philosophy being like the telescope that's also a microscope, and you've got a map, and
Yeah.
you can zoom in to higher resolution, or
Mhm.
you can zoom out, or you can zoom in. And so I guess the context is almost like the power of the telescope, like whatever magnification, or whatever
Yeah,
they're called. Yeah.
that would work
But
as a metaphor.
yeah, well, that was yours. I just extended it. And
Yeah.
then the other thing I was thinking about was, I guess the difficulty then is like, you can, like you gave the example of, I'm concerned with electric car competition, or I'm concerned with bottlenose dolphins in wherever. But if you're studying a specific subject, it's actually that there's a skill in even setting the context, because you may be missing, you
Hmm.
can go do observations on data, and that's great. But if you set the context, if you don't, there may be a little thing that you're missing that you haven't put in your context, and you don't learn anything compared to, you know. So
Hmm.
there's like a requirement also to be able to even set the context. I don't know how, yeah, I don't know how you'd figure out. I guess it goes back to fundamentals, but even that is not, I don't have an
Yeah, I
answer to
mean,
like,
that's why you study like what is existence, what is consciousness.
yeah.
It's at some basic concepts and ways of thinking which you can then apply. And that's in that sense, that's why science depends on philosophy. There's no such thing as science without philosophy. Like some people like to say that they don't need philosophy, science tells them everything. But philosophy is just the context and what it means to know something, what it means to say something is true in the first place.
Right.
That yeah, there are hard questions and philosophy is partly the way to figure out what it is. That's what philosophy does.
Hmm. Um,
And yeah, if you had one answer, then you would have philosophy figured out forever and ever, and nobody would ever need it. But you're identifying exactly why it's important and why it's difficult.
uh, wait. So what do you mean if you had one answer, you'd know everything? Like, are you talking about
Like
philosophy?
if you
And
had
then
the
you,
answer to philosophy, if you
okay.
had the answer, if somebody had the answer,
That could hit you in some
yeah,
uh, immediate insight. Yeah, okay.
yeah, but that is the problem with philosophy. Like that's why it's hard.
Yeah. Yeah, like these kind of questions, like figuring out what is an appropriate context, what isn't
Mhm.
yeah. It is hard. Well, let's go, because I feel like I dislike myself when I talk in this very abstract way. I feel like it means nothing sometimes. Let's go to I'll try to find a specific example. I'm reading Musashi. Do you know the book Musashi? It's about a Japanese Miyamoto Musashi. It's about a Japanese samurai. It's a fictional recreation of his story. And there's a scene in there where he's taken his friend. He's young. He's like Musashi is 17. He's not called Musashi at this point. He's called Takezo. He takes his friend into a battle, and his friend disappears. And like when Musashi comes back to his small town, the mother of the friend is very angry at Musashi. And so she's like, she thinks he's disgraced her family name, and there's all this you know, issue of honor in Japanese society. Like now her eldest son is gone from the family, and then that it goes on to like show her later
Mhm.
on in the book chasing him and trying to get her revenge because he dishonored her family name and her dignity. And so in terms of the context for that, like I'm thinking, okay, well, there's maybe Japanese culture. There is maybe the fact that Musashi took her son and she interpreted that as it's his fault. Um, like if I'm explaining it to someone, let's say, like so in that specific example, like when I'm thinking about context might also mean not only if I'm explaining it to someone, but context could be different depending on whether it's myself or I'm explaining it to someone else. It depends on the purpose of what I'm trying to achieve with the thought, right?
Yeah,
Like if
I
I'm
think so.
okay, cool. And so maybe for someone else, like if I'm explaining that to you, the context is Musashi, the story, the battle, and the fact that the mother's interpreted that Musashi is responsible for her son disappearing. But if I'm thinking about it myself, the context is Japanese culture because I already know that she's gone off. He's taken the son into battle, and the mother of the son interpreted it as it's his fault. Does that make sense? I'm saying for me, there's one element that's in the context, which is okay, Japanese. There's something here, dignity, Japanese culture, and then for you, maybe I have to tell you the whole thing to give you the context.
Yeah, I think at an individual level, you might know a lot more anyway, because that's where you might be reading it is because you knew some of the context already and you don't need the big picture so much. You really want to get in the uniqueness of the story. But if somebody's not familiar with Japanese history or even Japanese culture, you might want to point out different essentials to them that they might not have considered.
Okay.
Which, yeah, I guess the could say there's different context in the sense that the two of you are trying to understand different things. Even you broadly speaking, you might both want to care about Japanese history and be interested, but I could say your context is much more experienced. Like you might want even more in-depth stuff than somebody just starting out to read the book. Things like that.
Yeah. Okay. So context includes purpose, and the it's objective in the sense that it depends and varies depending on the requirements of the person doing the thinking and obviously the subject.
Yeah, and of course you could modify the context so in a way that it's the same for both of you even. Like there might be some things that they are interested in that you're not and vice versa. But there's a way
Okay.
sometimes even to overlap the two interests that you're both thinking about the same thing for the same reason, for the same end. You might want to be talking about a specific moral problem. And the context can be setting the parameters of the problem, like who's mad at who, why are they mad, and what happened. And you could use that to discuss the moral problem. You're discussing the moral problem in context. You're not just using some variables. You're actually thinking about the real thing that happened or the fictional event that happened.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, we can definitely. I've got heaps of
Mhm.
questions about context and interrelation of concepts and this kind of thing, but it'll be in that chapter 5. I have to go through it again as well because it was
Yeah.
very hard. All right. Well, why don't we do some of, unless you've got anything else you want to mention or say, we can go to this OPA chapter 1 reality.
Okay. Yeah, I have it open.
Okay, cool. You can go to page
8.
Yes, I'm highlighting stuff there. Can you see it?
Yeah. Well, wait. Where did you? There it is.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So you can read it and then I'll explain to you
Yeah.
what my issue is here.
A fact is necessary if its non-existence would involve a contradiction. To the to put the point positive, a fact that obtains by necessity is one that obtains by identity. Given the nature of existence, this is the status of every fact. Nothing more is required to ground necessity.
Okay. So I here's something that happens to me when I read some of this philosophy. I read it and I go, yeah, that makes sense. If something is a fact, uh to say it wouldn't be a fact doesn't make sense. But then there's so many words used to explain this. I'm like, okay, something here, there's more significance to this than I'm aware of. Like maybe necessary is like this big concept in philosophy. And so I don't really get what, like, okay, if that's how they're defining necessary, fine. But what's the big deal here is what I was, uh, you know, when I read this, I'm like, okay, so necessary is a fact. Great. But what, yeah. Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm like, I can read something and go, it makes sense, but so what? Like, I don't get why there's so many words used to explain this.
Well, in philosophy, there's um, necessary versus contingent.
Ah, okay.
That's kind of what he's referring to.
Okay, let me just, okay.
And the idea being that contingent things didn't have to be that way, but they are. But necessary things are true by necessity, whatever that might mean. But like it had to be that way versus it didn't have to be that way. And Picasso is saying, well, anything that is had to be that way by identity. It's just there's no other way it could be besides what its identity is. Like somebody might say that it's a contingent fact that water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius, but it's a necessary fact that the law of non-contradiction is true. Like, and it might seem weird to even distinguish it that way, but the difference between one has to be versus one didn't have to be.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
I think that's what he's trying to refer to, just anyone who might have that objections, like, or that way of thinking.
Okay. I then ask, okay, a choice, like the fact that humans have choice is by identity, but is that by necessity? I guess the fact that they have choice is by necessity as well, but the fact that they make a choice is not by necessity. Well, no, the fact that they choose a certain thing as opposed to another is contingent, but the fact of them even being able to choose in the first place is a necessity. Did I get that, arrange that right?
Well, Peikoff is saying that the necessary versus contingent dichotomy is pointless. There's no reason to say there's necessary or contingent. They're all necessary. Anything that's a contradiction, well, a fact is necessary if its non-existence would involve a contradiction. But the non-existence of any fact, contingent or otherwise, would involve a contradiction. It's kind of what he's
Ah,
getting
okay.
at. But
Okay.
also that the identity is what determines what has to be.
Yep. Okay. So I think what I missed here is that there is a big discussion in philosophy of necessary versus contingent. That was the context that I missed.
Yeah, or at least it was bigger when philosophy, when Peikoff wrote that. I'm not
Okay.
sure how big it is anymore, but it
Okay.
is a thing out there.
Yep. Hmm. Okay, cool. So he's yeah, all right, I get it. That clarifies everything for me. There was a context I was missing then.
Yeah,
Okay, done. I wrote that note, so oh good. Let's have a look at this thing with the Timaeus. I'll find the bolded so you don't have to read everything.
yeah, I read it already. I mean,
Okay,
I
all
read
right.
the paragraph a little
Okay.
earlier. I read it.
Uh-huh. Um, let's see what I wanted to know about this. Oh, okay, yeah, this is probably, I don't know if we need to go into this necessarily because this is more, I was curious, like, can you really trace, like, I like the way he wrote this, but can you really trace every, mind-body dichotomy to Plato or,
I would say no. Like you can see it ever since Plato, for sure. And some people get inspiration from Plato, and
oh,
there's
okay,
connection, but it's not like I would disagree to the extent
yeah,
that Peikoff is might be claiming it.
mm-hmm.
But sure, there's inspiration ever since Plato. He may be the earliest example of it.
Okay. And then I think the source of all these questions was trying to tie like all this sounds good, but I was trying to tie it down to specifics from my life. Like for example, if someone wishes the past were different, or like what's it called when you reminisce? Or is it reminiscing? I don't know, whatever. But wishing is that or dwelling, is that an example of the mind-body dichotomy? Since there's a difference between like let's say wishing the past was different or dwelling and reflecting to learn from. Um, And so I wonder if that's a mind-body dichotomy, because you're like you're living somewhere else. You're not in the present.
I wouldn't like calling it a mind-body dichotomy, but I would feel an issue of primacy of consciousness. Like, I'm not sure what word to use to describe like a lesser primacy of consciousness. Like, you can have that thought occasionally without meaning anything, but if it's something you do all the time, it might reflect like that you keep expecting your mind to do something and be enough, but it never is.
Yeah.
And that can make you depressed and so on.
Yeah. Okay, maybe we'll. I think, yeah, what I was getting at was like more of the like, okay, when you say moral versus practical, value versus fact, inner versus outer, I wanted to have like if you ask me that now, I'm like, I really have to struggle to think of like, okay, value versus fact. What's that? You know? And I was trying to find like fill my head with, okay, this is value versus fact, and this and that and this, but I don't have any of that. So
At least, well, Peacock are trying to say they're not really, there's no dichotomy between these. It's not either or.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
Peacock would probably be talking about that facts would imply objectively what we ought to value,
Yeah.
and what's within you does have a relationship with that side of you, that what you think isn't going to shape the outside, or what the outside isn't going to necessarily shape the inside. That there's a, and what's moral isn't separate from what serves your life.
Mm.
Like lying shouldn't cause you to suffer, for example. Like, by this understanding, there's all integrated, and like that, the mind and body are integrated. It's not what you wish on the one hand versus what is. Like that dichotomy screws up thinking.
Can you think of an example of how, like, let's say, so this latter part, if you expect, so an example of someone expecting reality, like a specific psychological example of someone expecting reality to conform to their wish, and then having an issue of like being able to mentally create a psychological profile of someone doing that, like a fictional example, and then trace how that goes to a value versus fact dichotomy. You know what I'm saying? I'm trying to. One thing I like about Ayn
Yeah,
Rand, for example, is, and the reason I find I well, like when I read Philosophy Who Needs It and this is like because she can go to specific examples like, oh, this is how it's relevant to my life. Whereas, let's say you read someone else, it's you can just stay in this world of like very abstract terms, and it's like okay. So I'm trying to be
um,
able to do that as well. Like, oh, how do I come up with examples that like, okay, show me how if I read the Timaeus and I like it, and suddenly I feel like what does it look like for my mind to um, um, think that reality conforms to my wish and then have a value fact dichotomy. You get what I'm saying?
yeah, it's those examples are actually pretty hard. I'm going to think about it for a second.
Well, I couldn't think.
I
I
could
was
think of
like, yeah.
maybe some extreme examples,
Hmm.
like perhaps Hitler, just because he had very extravagant beliefs in a way that as he became more unhinged, he more and more focused on just how he wanted things to be or wished it was. Like he was imagining even the Third Reich would last forever until the
Yeah.
end of time by his will alone, in a way. And that Germany was destined to last forever, even through the war, even after they were losing. Or that he'll go in the face of losing and take all the drugs to distract himself, which he did take. Or it could be,
What's
and
the
that would be
value? What's the value fact dichotomy though? There.
value. That one's harder to. I really can't give an example for that.
Yeah, okay.
Value versus fact dichotomy.
Maybe it is just a case of reading heaps of fiction. So you have all these like psychological profiles of different people. And then, because
Yeah.
this is really hard, but that's one thing I'm trying to do as well with what I'm reading.
Well, value detached from fact would be like hedonism. You pursue anything merely because it feels desirable. And you can say, oh, it's a value because I want it. But in what connection does it have to fact? Like if somebody wants to like have heroin a lot, then on some level they're saying that their desire of it supersedes the fact of the matter that it harms their life or that it impacts their life. Or somebody might say that um, I'm trying to think of an opposite example where me maybe saying that the only thing you should pay attention to is a fact just because it's that way detached from yourself and take value out of the equation, that what you want has nothing to do with anything. It's only about the fact and nothing. At no point do your interests come into play. Maybe like some really extreme ascetic in a monastery that throws off all material value because it counteracts or goes against the will of God or the facts that God has made in reality, that you have to ignore your values in order to understand the truth.
That's still, yeah, it's still abstract. I get what you're saying.
It is, but I mean that's the most concrete I can get.
Yeah.
Just think
Well,
of a
like,
monk who
yeah.
doesn't. Yeah,
I'll try to be on the lookout for it when I'm trying to read more fiction. So when I do, I'll try to be on the lookout for like, it would be really cool to, I don't know if this is the case, but one goal I have is if I study just philosophy in general in more depth, is being able to see it play out in specific characters and people, like if I'm reading a book, for example, even if it's implicit. And then I'll have those examples to go with. But otherwise, yeah, I couldn't really. I was like, all right, all that sounds great, but show me exactly what this looks like. I couldn't.
yeah, that's a good thing to look out for. Like, yeah, that is more a matter of once you know to look out for it, you can start checking if it's even true.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay, maybe we'll skip it because it's. Oh, I mean, yeah,
Yeah, I don't
probably.
have any more to say on that specifically anyway. It's
Yeah.
even difficult for me to talk about. That is one of the more harder things I've found to understand.
You
Like
know,
value versus fact, I don't. Moral versus practical, I'm fine with, but the other two, I wasn't sure about.
okay, those are specifics. For me, it's even broader. It's like, I know I
Yeah,
don't get it. If I'm writing like that conceptual frequency, Fred, if I'm just talking like that all the time, then I don't get it because I should be
of
able to go to
course.
very specific examples.
Right.
Because you can sound great, like with all these big words, but if I'm like not really, anyway, you can still not get it. It's like a specialist
Mhm.
talking within their field with all their lingo.
That's what
Um,
David does sometimes. As you saw in his,
okay.
he has
Yeah.
really linguistic stuff. It's like, simplify it a bit, please. That's
Yeah.
how I feel about him sometimes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
So it's
but
not just you.
yeah. Um, I noticed that even within like finance, someone can know all these words and terms and throw them around and they're like grammatically correct, but it doesn't mean they know anything. So it's like
I
there's a
know.
projection of intelligence, but when you try and go like, how does this relate to this? Or what's this? Give me an example of this, and they can't, you know, they just don't know. So it's like
Mhm.
I don't want to be like that in anything.
Yeah.
Uh, all right, let's do this stuff. Let's see if it's the same. Okay, let me go through this as well. So it's a section on idealists, and then wider. So the wider section is idealism and materialism as the rejection of basic axioms. The idea of supernatural. I'll read it to myself, so you can also do that. Um,
Mhm.
Okay, so it's about, I think it's about this part. Is God the designer of the universe? Not if A is A, the alternative of design is not chance, it is causality. Um, yeah, okay, so I had a question. All right, maybe I didn't get causality because I thought causality is a thing isn't that causality? Like what you apply
Yes.
to an action of entities? Uh, yeah, so I didn't quite get that.
Um, well, he's just responding to say that when people say God designed the universe, they will often argue the alternative to saying God designed the universe is that the universe came to be by chance.
Mm-hmm.
Like it just randomly came out this way. We got lucky, and that's that.
Mm-hmm.
But Pico was saying, well, that's the alternative is what could be causality. That's just the nature of entities necessarily lead to a certain state of the universe. But it's not an accident that the Earth ended up orbiting the sun. Like it came by nature over time about all the entities that have interacted. And you don't necessarily need God to design it. The God to set the world in motion to make it possible for cause anything to happen. It's just on some level he's not really answering the question because usually people who believe in God think that his design is causality, that he designed causality. I mean,
God is the
but
cause in this case. So the one alternative is God is the cause, but he's trying to, I guess, get at there's some issue there with chance, which I don't get to be honest, but as in not what Peikoff's saying, but whoever's saying it's either God or it's all just random chaos. There's something deeper which I don't get that he's referring to. Like it can't be chance, it's causality, but then I didn't get causality. So
yeah, I think I'm not sure I like the way he wrote this, but he's responding to the theist who said God designed the universe, and because the alternative is chance. And Peikoff is trying to say that maybe on some level that if the existence is the way it is, then causality would necessarily be a certain way. It's not, no, there's no such thing as an accident. Like A is not an accident. It's not contingent, I should say. Like he was saying that not contingent versus necessary is a invalid dichotomy. He's
right,
saying
okay.
that the theist might say that the alternative to necessity is contingency. But you're saying, well, everything's necessity. And you're kind of like exploding the question in the first place.
What what's the so contingent chance is dependent on contingency? Is that the
Chance
concept?
is basically, that's basically contingency. It didn't have to be that way, therefore it
Ah,
just kind
okay.
of is. It just no
Okay.
reasons that way. It's just completely random. Nothing caused it to be.
Ah, there's no cause, basically. Well, I mean,
But
you could
just
have a contingency with cause, but in this case, it's a contingency without cause, so it's random. Is that's
essentially, yeah.
but he's saying there's no such that there is cause, and so everything has a cause, and so it's not uh you can't you're denying causality. Is that
This is a bit complicated because he's saying that, well, one, we're taking into account that all facts are necessary. There's no such thing as a necessary or contingent fact. I mean, they all have to be. And secondly, that God is a form of primacy of consciousness, that a consciousness created reality. And he's trying to identify a problem here.
okay?
Like when you combine that dichotomy with primacy of consciousness, you get this is what you get. Like, oh, God has to design the universe. Because that's the way we resolve the necessary versus contingent. Necessary things are the way God has made it by his will. That's how
Oh,
I'm
wow, that's
understanding free
interesting.
will.
So if in philosophy you believe that there's some dichotomy between the necessary and contingent, I don't even know what that would look like, but if you do, then God is actually almost an explanation for the universe. It kind of like it would be understandable for someone to come to say, all right, well, someone had to design it.
Yeah, because they need
Wow.
some explanation for why. I mean, they're trying to find an explanation, and that's what they end up with, like God created it. And I
Yeah,
can see
wow.
that's where P. Cuff is kind of getting at when we take into account the what he was just writing about. I'm trying to relate the two together, and
I think
and
I
that's where I
also
saw it.
I think I also need more context for this necessary contingent because without that, clearly, like I
Yeah,
don't really, yeah, okay. Which I think, like you said, it was a broader thing in philosophy before, maybe not now, but I don't have any of that context, so I can't
yeah,
do much with that.
yeah.
All right.
So we'll go to the next part.
Yeah, for sure. Let me just cross that out. All right, it might be the same style, so maybe we'll skip it. Let's have a look. Um, there is no logic that will lead one from the facts of this world to a realm contradicting them. There is no concept formed by observation of nature that will serve to characterize its antithesis. Hmm. Okay. Ah, okay. I think I know where I'm going with this. Might seem like a really dumb question, but um, I think what I'm trying to identify is that okay, we're actually making observations and then doing like form when we're forming concepts, it's not a deduction. It's like you're jumping from a few things you observe. Like, okay, I haven't yet seen me form a concept observing nature and being able to characterize something that denies nature. So therefore, I know that you can't form any concept by observing nature that denies nature. Does that, I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but like, I
Mm-hmm.
guess what I was getting at is like, there's no magic deduction you do. It's more like you make a few observations and you're like, yeah, it's not possible to deny it. I've seen enough.
Mm, there is no logic that lead one.
Inductive statement. This is going back to, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Because
Um,
I'm seeing this and I'm like, all right, well, how do I, maybe all my concepts are wrong because I was like, or maybe a lot of them are anyway, because I was like, well, how do I prove that? So I know it 100% that I can't contradict nature. Because that when I said that to myself, I know this is still too abstract for me to be like, there's something here I'm missing. I think I was trying to get at what it was. Because I was still like, well, how do I know for sure? I was asking myself that I can't find a way to.
um, he
And if I
makes me
go, yeah, sorry.
he makes me think of something Aristotle came up with reasoning where like you find the opposites of things. And it's other Eastern philosophy too sometimes,
What do you mean?
where you can find and understand the truth of something by understanding its opposite, which is like understanding its contradiction, which can get really weird. I forget what this term is. Aristotle logic square? Let me see. He's just saying that you can't come to understand something by looking at its antithesis. You don't just look at the opposite and that will tell you the truth of things. I mean, it wouldn't make sense to find the truth by contradicting it on purpose. Like, you don't understand light by understanding dark. And it wouldn't make sense to just understand light by its contradiction. If you want to know how things are, if you want to understand darkness, study darkness, which we would know really isn't even a thing. It's just no light. It's not the opposite. It's just no light. Or people used to think that cold was a substance or a thing and hot was a thing. And you had to
What
understand
do you
hot,
mean
you
a
could
thing
understand.
in hot was a thing? What's that?
Well, some scientists used to think that what caused heat was just the opposite of what, like an opposite thing of what caused cold. Like there's something that causes heat and there's something that causes cold.
Oh,
That's what
okay.
scientists used to think until
Wow.
they found out that, oh, heat is really just moving molecules. It's not like there's a special property of coldness.
Mm.
And if you want to understand heat, you don't want to study cold necessarily. You just study the thing you want to, find the facts, and then come to conclusions. I think that's what he's referring to. Like when he's talking about idealists, he's talking about people like Hegel, who might say they want to understand the antithesis of something as a way to understand that something, which doesn't really make sense, at least if you're going by what Peikoff has said about idealism, like primacy of consciousness and necessary versus contingent, blah, blah, blah.
Okay, I understand what you're saying. So some philosophers say to understand something, you must understand the opposite, but with the example of this is, and Aristotle says something about this as well, but with the example of light.
So.
Okay. With the example of, yeah.
Just to clarify from before, I was saying that such a person, the theist I was describing, who says God designed the universe, I was saying they are a person who believes in the dichotomy. So they believe there are necessary facts. They believe there are contingent facts. And if you believe in that, if you believe in necessary versus contingent, without God, everything would be contingency to their mind. But there are necessary facts. So to describe it, to explain the fact that necessary facts exist, they need God. But if you remove God, all you have left is contingency. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah,
That's all I was saying.
Think more about that. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that but yeah.
What did I write that made you think that?
Well, you said we resolve a necessary contingent dichotomy. It's not that you're resolving the dichotomy, but you're resolving the issue. To resolve the issue of everything being contingent, just throw in God, and God explains all the necessary things. Randomness explains all the contingencies.
Okay, wait, say that again, because I obviously didn't get something. So, okay, you're not resolving a necessary there's no, because I interpreted it, there's no such thing as well, there is such thing as contingent. Okay, so I've got something wrong here.
Well, there isn't, but if we imagine the theist who does believe in it,
yeah,
and who does believe in primacy of consciousness, this is what we get. It's confusing and doesn't make sense.
Okay, but there's no such thing as contingent. There's just the necessary.
Yeah, or even necessary. There's no necessary or contingent. It's just all facts are facts. There's nothing to distinguish. You don't need this concept of necessary or contingent. You just throw it out. It's useless.
Oh, okay. I got to think about that more. That's interesting.
But if you keep it, that's when you get problems.
Wow, that's super interesting.
It's not either or. You don't want it at all.
Yeah, okay. See, this is what I'm like, I think is cool, because if you, let's say I think about something and there's something wrong with my concepts, like I've captured some aspect of reality that's not important, then all the rest of my thinking might be based on that. And I start getting into all these weird errors, and not only errors, but I put all this cognitive effort trying to figure out something that is not, I'm not looking at the right place. I'm just expending effort, like spinning my mental wheels. I think this is a cool example of that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's go back to this thing on. Maybe we should continue this later because we're getting pretty close to just.
Oh, I found the term